Not again, not again, not again. Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. I'm Bradley Tuck, and in today's episode we are going to be talking to Christine Louis-Dit-Sully about the politics of civil liberties and freedom of speech. In a period of political authoritarianism, increased scope and power of private tech firms, and a series of crises that have required a fundamental rethinking of our political certainties, it may be said that issues of free speech and civil liberties have become fundamental and pressing. Likewise, in a context where political conservatives have found a professed ally in freedom of speech, those of us committed to progressive and leftist ideas need to think through what our understanding of civil liberties and freedom amounts to. In order to think through some of these issues, we will be joined by Christine Louis-Dit-Sully, an academic biologist, writer and free speech advocate. She is the author of Transcending Racial Divisions, Will You Stand By Me?, that will be released with Zer0 Books later in 2021. In this session, she will be joining us to discuss a range of ideas relating to freedom of speech, censorship and the politics of identity. What makes Christine's work interesting is her ability to be both provocative and nuanced, fiercely defending freedom of speech, yet unafraid to challenge professed free speech advocates and their assumptions. Central to Sully's exploration of free speech and civil liberties is her attempt to develop thought on how anti-racism and other political struggles can be pursued without falling into some of the pitfalls of identity politics and its opponents. She has often criticised identity politics for the way extremely small numbers of the characteristics that would be used to describe me as an individual, such as being black, a woman and a foreigner, are supposed to determine my opinions, my reasoning styles, my ideas, my beliefs, my preferences for hairstyles, my tastes in food and other aspects of my life. Yet she also notes that professed opponents of identity politics still believe that my identities and the supposed personal benefits they give me determine my opinions. Challenging both sides of the debate, Sully's work could be said to provide a provocative intervention, shifting away from tendencies for such discussions to ossify around notions of culture wars and reignite a radical discursive politics. This session was run on the 12th of January 2021 as part of the Exploding Appendix Avant-Garde Art Practice and Research Group's fortnightly meeting, which takes place on Zoom and is open to all. So if you're interested in joining our discussions, send me a message at explodingappendix@gmail.com or check out our website at www.explodingappendix.com for more information about our events and our podcasts and other projects that we're involved in. So I think my first question is a really general one. So it's sort of about what do we mean by free speech, freedom, or civil liberties, and why would these things be kind of worth defending?
Let's start with the easy question first. I've been thinking about this issue, and 2 years ago, I was thinking that the most important freedom we had to fight for was freedom of speech, because the argument was, if you don't fight for freedom of speech, you cannot fight for any other freedom. And I still support freedom of speech, but I don't think I agree with this position anymore. Because I think that, first of all, because I think the discussions about freedom of speech becomes a discussion where the discussions about freedom is avoided. And that's the reason for me why freedom of speech has been taken up by some people who never argue or never fought for the issue of freedom itself. So I make a difference between freedom of speech and freedom. So freedom of speech is a civil liberty. So for me, I see civil liberties like freedom of speech, freedom of association, right to protest as important freedom and right that we have to support, because it allows us to fight for, I suppose it allows us to fight for something better than what we have today. But I do not agree with it becoming, as a lefty, becoming the end result. And I think for me, freedom of speech has become something that people think as if it was the end result of what we should be fighting for. And that's why I changed my position from freedom of speech is the most important freedom we have to fight for, to let's look at what we mean by freedom and how important freedom of speech is in our fight for freedom. when I did my research, I was looking at how do we carry on. I don't know should I carry on or just
carry on.
When I was discussing freedom of speech in the beginning, I was thinking, why is it becoming such an important issue? Why is it that some people who never been interested in freedom of speech find it so easy to support freedom of speech? And we know that when we're discussing freedom of speech, some people look at freedom of speech as freedom for my friends, but not freedoms for my the people I disagree with. So in that sense, you would say, well, yes, they don't really support freedom of speech. But even if they really support freedom of speech, why is it becoming such an issue? And then I was trying to understand what we mean by freedom. In society, for example, people say that we are censored today, but I grew up in a time where some people could not discuss issues. I mean, as I was a communist in 90s, for example, and I would not have said I'm a communist while I was doing some science, for example, because I would have put discussing, especially a black communist, is not something that in the 90s, I would have been happy to reveal. So, because I knew that, in the certain position, is not something that ideas were always been censored. So I think I'm going in different places. But the important discussion is, what do we mean by freedom? And when I did my research on what do we mean by freedom, maybe I'm a bit naive, but I realized that the meaning of freedoms has changed a lot from what people mean today and what it is meant in the past. So when I say I fight for freedom, people will mean I fight for freedom of speech or freedom of association, freedom of protest. And it's always about freedom away from the state. So the state giving me the right to be able to do things away from their interference. But there is another notion of freedom that hasn't been discussed for a long time. And I think this is why I think freedom of speech is an easy issue to discuss today. I mean, ask questions. I'm not very clear because my aim in politics, for me, in what I think is a problem today, is that when we are involved in politics, most of the time nowadays, we do not have a political aim. And I think this is the reason why I'm against identity politics. And not only left identity politics, but also right identity politics. And this is why I also understand identity politics as something which is in the past. Because I think what you mean by politics is normally, how can we organize society for us to be better? Today, politics is not that. It's how can a black person fight for the right for a black person? How can a woman fight the right for the woman? How can a gay lesbian fight for the gay lesbian? And so for me, I have to start with what is my aim in politics? And my aim in politics is to have a society where most of us have the right to develop our potential. So I start as a lefty. The freedom for me is how can humans be in a society where their potential as individuals can be developed, fully developed. So then I go and if my political aim is that, how can I go about doing that? Is freedom of speech enough? What does freedom mean today? This is how I go.
It's almost like seeing freedom of speech as part of a broader network of ideas about freedom, which include, I suppose, what you might say if you can describe like positive freedom and negative freedom or something like that.
No, this is
no.
Well, yes, in one way, yes, because when you look at the discussions about the state, so state interference.
Yeah.
But at the moment, I follow more the ideas of two authors I read so far and other people also. The discussions about freedom as away from interference from the state and freedoms as non-domination. And it reminded me of what Marx discussed on freedom, for example. It's basically, in a way, I have the right to, for example, I would have the right to write an article, but as a working class in the past, there is no way I will have the opportunity to write the article and to be heard. So I would have the formal right to write. The opportunity in society will have been completely negligible. And for me is that when we talk about freedom of speech and freedom, is that we are always forgetting one part of the society that's affecting us. If we talk about freedom away from the state and from interference, it's a liberal, this is what I have been doing for my research, is that it seems to be a liberal individual freedom that's been developed only in the 19th century, where basically the liberal argued that you, as workers, you are free to choose, choose to work. And then you have, as long as you have the right to be able to have your life away from the state, you're free. But this is a very different ideas of freedom that people used to fight in the past, a freedom for domination. So i.e. the right to be able to have a life without being dominated by the structure of society, but also by other human beings. So when you think about workers, they have the right to work if they want to choose their work, but they're also being exploited by the workers. Or you have the right to be able to say something, but most of the people, the majority of people in this world do not have the possibility of saying anything. So it's basically formal rights in formal politics. So a right in formal politics, but not freedom in life as a concrete things.
So I think sometimes it's like rephrased as something like, the freedom to starve.
For example,
Right?
I wouldn't go there.
Or the freedom to starve if you don't want to go to a particular employee and be exploited, for example.
For example, I mean, how I go through my mind is that, I was a communist in the past, and I would say, okay, we want to have the freedom and democracy in this society, and we have to change for another society. But I don't want to go necessarily in that way. I just think that we have to see, what do we want for us? What we want as human beings, because this is, for me, politics is that, is how, as a society, what do we, as members of society, want for all of us? If you ask for freedom of speech only, if you ask for freedom of association, you're saying that you have a certain good things in life in the formal politics, but in life we have more than the formal politics. So the power, the economic power or the social power is not being discussed. And actually, I was, you can see when I'm discussing that, I'm going through different ideas at the moment. So I was reading Wood, Ellen Meskin Wood. I don't know if you know her. And I think she's very good in basically showing how the difference between the society that we have today compared to the past. And why is it that it's so easy to discuss freedom of speech or freedom associations or freedom, right to protest in a society where you have a difference between the political power, the economic power, and the social power. And when we discuss politics, we are discussing the formal world of the formal political world, but we do not discuss the social and the economic life that we have, despite the fact it is very important in our life. So we can have the freedom of speech, but we don't have the freedom of speech in the sense that we don't have the power to be able to talk. And the majority of people do not have the power to talk. I mean, they have no opportunity. Yeah.
So there's that element of opportunity there as well. Does anyone have anything to ask?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I completely agree that I think, freedom is like a material question, right? It's not only a formal or, a liberal position. I mean, I think, not only are all these freedoms connected insofar as we discuss them, like the freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, association and speech, but they're always material and practical and political question rather than an abstract one. And I think even where Marx is talking about the censorship of the press, for example, some of his earliest work is on, censorship in the press. And there is a Marxist case to be made for a defense of freedom of expression and so on, albeit, slightly complicated one. And I think what you're talking about, this kind of question of flourishing as well, like what does it mean to actually, for people to have the best possible life in a certain way, like if that's our image of politics and how we kind of govern ourselves collectively. So like the question of freedom then is always going to be a kind of collective question rather than one based on an abstract or formal or given set of political rights, right? It's not really a question of liberal rights in that way. I suppose, one thing, just thinking about the current context, perhaps particularly in America, sorry to bring this up in this way, but, it seems to me there's a kind of collapse of like state and corporate policing. Obviously, we live in a very surveilled, monitored world in many ways. There's kind of group policing. There's been a lot of policing of things that people have said, and people have been punished in different ways, even people going so far as to write to employers. And there's something in human nature that sometimes seems to be able to be drawn out, like when we think about the Stasi and snitching, and in the COVID situation also makes that quite prominent as well, like the levels of social disapproval. So for people stepping out of line, let's say, there's always a kind of anthropological possibility of human beings punishing each other. And I suppose, just thinking about this situation, I mean, in the UK, but US especially, where you perhaps have a kind of crackdown from the corporations. The major platforms obviously have banned Trump and lots of other right-wing speakers and thinkers, and we may or may not agree with that. We might think there's good reason. We might have a limit about whether calling for violence crosses a line you know, it's not the same as freedom of thought and expression, it's actually incitement or something like that. That's always a discussion that people bring up when we're talking about freedom of speech in particular. But also at the same time, you seem to have the state and the corporations working together in this kind of policing of certain types of speech, or certain kind of people are being shut down on the left as well, right? And I think the point about once censorship begins at this level, you know, it may start to, as you say, like attack our enemies, but then ultimately it also may come for you too, right? It depends on who's doing the censoring, right? So whether it's the state or the corporations, or as is seemingly happening, both at the same time, or it's hard to differentiate, let's say, between the government and these major platforms online. And I just wondered if you know, from this position that you're articulating, this kind of materialist collective image of politics, you know, what you think is kind of going on, whether, you know, that's what's happening, whether I'm, you know, what I'm saying seems relevant, or do you think something else is at stake? Maybe it's not quite to do with these, you know, formal freedoms, but rather something else.
I'm not sure if I understood exactly the question at the end compared to what you said before, but when you think about, you have censorship from the state, but you have censorship within society. So corporations at the moment, but you also have censorship or preventing people talking from other groups of people. So basically censorship from, one way you could say, within a civil society. This is not new. I think this is also, in one way, I think what's happening is who's asking for censorship is a bit different from the past. But the censorship that we have today, I have to say that I disagree with the cancel culture concept, and we can discuss it later. But I just think that I support freedom of speech, but if we only concentrate on what's happening today, then we also realize that there is more than just the freedom of, how can I explain it? For me, it reminds me that the prevent us to be free in society is not only the state. And so the corporation is not something that is, you know, the big corporations or the industrial groups of people stopping us doing something. It's not something new. And it represents, in one way, another reflections of what we have in current society, where different institutions prevent people having the freedom to be able to express themselves, or to be able to protest, or be able to be free, basically. What I'm saying is that I cannot be too worried too much about the corporation, because I'm just thinking we are in a capitalist society where corporations or big industrial complexes or powerful economic power have already censored people throughout our society, throughout history, since the 18th, 19th century. So maybe it's a bit of a relativization, but I'm trying to see, why is it that we're so worried about corporations censoring us when at the end of the day, we have been censored before. And for me, in one way, you could say we have been censored before and we are censored today. It also shows that the state has less power today than in the past. But power of the economic power and social power has always existed. And we are seeing the economic and social power being upfront compared to the state. This is what I mean by freedom being more than just the formal freedom. Because if you're only looking at formal freedom, you're only looking at the state. When you have also freedom from how society is organized, the powers from the industrial, power for the employers, the powers from institutions, which we don't consider. So I'm against what the corporation is doing, but I do not think it's such a big difference from what it's been happening since capitalism started, in one way.
Rob, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Sorry, I missed the beginning of what you were saying, but everything that I did hear was really interesting, and it made me have loads of ideas. I especially liked when you started to talk about how you were a communist, but you didn't feel like you could make that public knowledge back in the 90s. And yeah, I think I agree with a lot of your ideas. And so with Trump and this whole storming of the Capitol building and Twitter banning Trump permanently, I didn't really form any judgments about that, but my friend we were talking, and he said it's quite scary that a corporation wields so much power that they can silence a world leader in that way. And regardless of what Trump says, it's scary that there are a handful of companies that have a monopoly on the distribution of information like Twitter. And I was just thinking what your opinion is on that and how it relates to freedom of speech. How would that ideally look, a system like that?
I'm against censorship. For me, I always go through the way I think about issue at the moment, and I may change in the future, but the way I look at the issue now at the moment, what do I want for the world? And so censorship, freedom of speech, even if I don't think freedom of speech is something that I will fight for as the aim in life, I think freedom of speech is important in making it easier for us to be able to express ideas and to develop. So I support freedom of speech. So if a corporation start censoring you or Trump, I would have problems with it. And to be honest, I don't have this big hoo-ha about Trump being censored, because I think that him being censored is as important as you being censored or my grandmother being censored. So I don't have these hoo-ha things. Although I do think that Trump is a bit more important than my grandmother, more important than my grandmother, I think that the censorship, I am against censorship. But I do not think that, for me, it's just a question, why do you think there is such hoo-ha about the big tech today? I mean, it's not something that, the fact that you have a monopoly on something is not something that is just appear in 21st century. So there is a lot of power in the hands of a few minority, a small minority. This been happening for a long time now. Jeff Bezos and what's his name, the other one, Elon Musk, somebody even mentioned, I think Karl Marx made the joke that you have feudalism, capitalism, and Bezosism, or something, Bezosism. In a sense of, you have a world where you have a huge inequality increased inequality between the majority of people and a few minority who have a lot of the power, a lot of the economic power, and in that case also a lot of the political power. And so I think we have to worry about it not only on the freedom of speech, in the sense of you have less and less control about how we organize our life. In that sense, it's not only freedom of speech, but who is organizing and who's deciding how we're going to organize society today. If you have a few people who have all the power, I don't have this, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't have this worry more about the power at the end of Bezos than I have the power in the end of politicians who do not represent me, or in the hands of industrial that I do, car industrial, or on the end of a few people, social powers, people, cultural power who have more power. I mean, what I'm saying is that at the moment, I'm worried about how can all of us, the majority, have a say in society. And this is just one example of what is stopping us having a say. I mean, time of my grandmother, the high tech, the big tech didn't censor her, but she had no say in what's happening in her life and the way society is organized. She had the freedom of speech, but she had no say. Why should we only be worried about what I see it as if it was like we have to worry about a liberal interest in the world, when if you're lefty, you want to do more than just having a capitalist society with a liberal right and freedom that is not freedom. And for me, this is how I see it, is that I want to have more than just a liberal right. I want to have freedom. So I support some liberal rights and some liberal values, but my aim is to have freedom for the people. And in the sense of, when I discuss democracy, for example, with the Brexit in Britain, democracy used to mean the rule of the people. When you talk of most of the people, most of the people do not believe that people should have a right to have a say, because they will say, I can have a point of view because I think and I read, but most people are stupid. So the idea that most of the people cannot make a choice about how they organize society is very widespread. So we have the contempt for others is very widespread. But this is one of the barriers that we have. If we are really for freedom, so if we really want to have a world where most of us as individuals developed and being free to develop as individuals, then we have to think about a bit going further than just freedom of speech or freedom of association. This is good, but this is not enough. So a corporation banning Trump is bad, but do I really want to only concentrate on that to be able to fight for a better world? Or do I want to do more than that? Do I want to be restricted basically I see it as a restriction in a conversation. So we have all the media and everybody else discussing one area of politics. And then it makes us forget about what we want really in society, at least for me, what I want in society. I don't want just Trump to be able to use Twitter. I want a world when we can govern ourselves. This is what democracy is about. It's about democracy and politics. It's about the majority of us governing,
yeah.
Yeah, governing, sorry. It's a, I know the big French accent coming up. It's about politics and democracy. Actually, Aristotle said politics is a practical science. It's about us, and he was against democracy, yes, but it's about the rule of the people. It's about other people, all of us deciding how we govern ourselves. And we had forgotten that. I mean, there is no left anymore fighting for that at the moment. That's what I'm worried about, is that we are discussing issues that are, we are reacting to issues that's happening in politics today, when in fact there is no politics today. And then we are forgetting why we were involved in politics in the first place, i.e. making a world where the majority can govern themselves, not only their private life, which is the liberty of negative and positive liberty. It's not only to govern what I feed to my kids. I don't want just this test freedom. I want the freedom to be able to organize how we produce things, how we teach ourselves, how we build society, how we protect the environment or not protect the environment. And this is what I think this idea of freedom, the democratic freedom, is not discussed today, except in a few individuals, but it's not discussed today. And this is what my aim is to change the discussions from Trump is banned, no, Trump is not banned, yes, Trump is banned, this is banned, to go to what do we want? What's happening to other people that they don't have a say at all? And why do we accept that?
Max, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to basically say I'm really sympathetic to this argument, and it's sort of formulating it in a way that I haven't before. But I wonder just how much it's incredibly intentional on the side, the kind of liberal wing of things, to keep the argument obsessively focused on form, as in the form of free speech, as opposed to its content. You know, what you're talking about here, democratic freedoms, etc. Because it reminds me of what Marcuse writes about repressive tolerance, and just saying there's a point where tolerance becomes, you know, a backward-facing sort of ideal. We tolerate so many kind of regressive and violent and sort of undemocratic ideas by cherishing this free speech form, which again seems to be very carefully crafted and weaponized by kind of liberal political institutions to keep this, you know, conversation in this area, you know, without focusing on what's being said. It's almost like the filibuster concept in American politics, but happening on like a macro level. If enough people are tabling ideas at the same time, which have to be upheld, you know, by this principle of free speech, then there's like an indefinite sort of delay of actually making any kind of concrete material social change. And it seems like a lot of Marxists have sort of forgotten about this in recent years. And I wonder if that's sort of in the right kind of area, or if I'm kind of misinterpreting you there.
Yeah. I mean, I said that in the beginning. I mean, I am doing an evolution in my thinking. So I hope you excuse me for being confused and confusing, because yes, when I've been doing my reading and my research, I just realized that a lot of the things that we are going today, it seems to we have forgotten some of the initial ideas that we used to fight as lefty. So people said that there is no communist and there is no radical politics, and it is true. There is no radical politics, there is no radical movement, and there is no radical politics and there is no radical movement. But we don't have to kind of rebuilding it as in the past. We have to think about how do we go above what we hear today in the media. So what are the barriers for us to be able to have what we want, basically? When I did my reading, doing my readings, I'm thinking at the moment, when we discuss society, for example, most of the people looking at society in a very sociological way. And when we say changing society, people will say, well, if you have more blacks on top of the society, then we're changing society. And as a lefty, at least as a Marxist, we know that by having more blacks on the top, we don't change society. We just change the faces in society, but we don't change the structure of society. We have to be able to look at it in a more materialistic way. So in one way, yes, I'm pushing the materialist, more materialist point of view that is being forgotten both by, hasn't been pushed by the right anyway, but it's been forgotten by everything that is being called left today. And that's the reason for me, freedom of speech is something that I will support, but I will no longer campaign for as such. Because I think that if I fight for freedom of speech, I am pushing away from any materialist concepts of freedom that we need to support. At the moment, every time I'm thinking about an issue, I'm thinking it, what do I want? And I'm stressing this point because this is what I think is the problem with identity politics today and politics. My argument at the moment is that at the moment we have no politics. We have identity politics. And we've been having identity politics, most identity politics, since the 19th century, 18th, 19th century. And identity politics was developed by the right, by the elite. And today, the left has embraced identity politics as well as the right, but the left embraced identity politics. And what I mean by identity politics is that we are fighting for something, a section of society are fighting for rights or freedom of their sections of society. But there is no ideas of the common. How can we fight for freedom as a whole? And I know that you wanted to discuss this liberatory politics and identity politics.
Yeah. Well, we had a session last year with Jeremy Gilbert, and he made quite a useful distinction, I thought, between liberation politics, which he kind of associated with like Black Power and Women's Lib and sort of things that emerged in the sort of 60s and 70s. And then he can kind of contrast that with the rise of identity politics more in the kind of 80s and stuff, where one was about sort of collective liberation, and but one was about sort of uniting somehow for some sort of collective form of liberation, whereas the other one was think of us each as individuals. Therefore, somehow uniting in some ways wasn't possible. So that was the distinction he made. And I was wondering, I just thought that was that sort of helped me in some ways to sort of think about some of those issues. And I wondered how much you ascribed to that, really.
What I mentioned before is that how I went from anti-racism to identity politics and freedom. So you can make a difference between identity politics in the sense of like women's rights movements, civil rights movements, gay lesbian movements. You could say that's identity politics, and it is identity politics. And you could say that they are fighting for the right things. They are fighting for rights that they did not have before, rights and civil liberties that they did not have before. So you could say, well, it's a good identity politics, and then others is bad identity politics. My issue with identity politics altogether is you can have some good identity politics and bad identity. How can I say it? Okay, what I'm saying is that first, let's look at a history of identity politics. Identity politics is about politics where you use an identity to fight for something, yes? And we have all identities, different identities. So when you look at it, identity politics started with race. That's the reason why I said it started in 18th, 19th century when race really developed. The concept of race developed fully in 19th century. And identity politics started in one way with race. It started with other stuff, but it really developed with race. And it developed with race, it developed with nation, so national identity and national character, national identity, and it developed with culture. Sorry, that's what I meant. You have identity politics where you are fighting for the interest of a particular groups of people. So when identity developed with race, it was fighting for the interest of the white elite. And they also developed it in the sense of white people, yes? They tried to make it as white people. So the identity politics started, and then identity politics was taken up by the left and by the social movement when the radical movement basically fell. And I have to say that I read recently an argument from somebody called Thomas. I don't know if you know J.M. Thomas. His argument is that in one way, the left has always been divided into basically two groups: the Rousseau left and the Marx left. So Marx Marx's argument is that he looked at society, capitalism, he saw that capitalism was better than what happened before, but he also understood that within capitalism, there is a possibility to create something better where individuals can be more developed and free. But he understood the evolution between the past, the past society and the present. The Rousseau argument left, basically for him, is that to be able to have better society is, for example, to destroy the idea of class. So you don't support the working class for the sake of supporting the working class. You support the working class with the aim of the abolition of classes. So you support the working class in order for the working class to abolish itself, and in that sense, all class. Yes? So this is how the evolution was. When you look at the left, which is what Thomas argued, the Rousseauist left, they actually do the other way around. They do not fight for the abolition of the working class, they celebrate the working class. So in a sense of they are promoting the working class value, working class ideas, working class politics, working class trade unions, working class way of dressing, way of life. And for me, it's really clear how, in one way, how identity politics in one way was influenced and other influence left-wing movement for quite a long time, because instead of fighting for the abolition, if you're a Marxist, the abolition of classes to have a society where you have more free individuals, you're fighting for groups of people, i.e. if you're a lefty, you're fighting for the working class to have their own values and their own trade unions and their own rights and their own, you know what I mean? And if you do that, then you're also forgetting the original political aim of freedom. Because what you're saying is that you're fighting for an identity, but you're not fighting for politics anymore. You're not doing politics anymore. What I mean by politics is freedom. So you're not doing politics anymore. You are fighting for the interests of groups of people. So that's the reason why you could say, well, yes, it's right. A working class politics is good. Black politics is good. Women's is good in the sense that they have more right than they used to have. And I'm not against the rights that we have. I think it's a good idea that we have civil liberties and rights. But at the same time, ultimate aim of freedom is lost. If we only follow what Thomas used to call the Rousseauist left, you're forgetting the ultimate aim of freedom, the ultimate aim of radical change of society, where we can go further than what we have today. Because for me, as long as we live in this society, we will not be able to have freedom as individuals. We will not be able to fully develop as human, not only as individuals, but as human. I'm talking about human emancipation. So for me, you could say that I'm not against black or women or gay and lesbian or trans to fight for rights or civil liberties. But if we concentrate only on that, we always forget the most important aim. For me, this is what is important. We always have to keep in mind, for me, we always have to keep in mind what is our aim. I will support the right for groups of people who are oppressed. I will support the right against oppression. But what is the aim that I want to support at the end of it? Is it only fighting for them to be equal rights, or is it for us to be free?
I suppose why Marx names the proletariat is not because he wants to celebrate that as an identity, but because he sees the proletariat as most likely to bring about the communist revolution.
Yeah, because of their position.
Yeah, so you can sort of side with people in terms of race or gender and sex, not because of, and this would not be identity politics, I guess, because you'd be siding with them because you see some sort of universal aim through coming out of that. Whereas identity politics, I suppose the different distinction I'm seeing you making here is that identity politics would focus on identity per se, whereas the particular group you're associating with, on the other hand, is an aim towards something else.
I think identity politics has been useful for different groups. So, like you said, that if black or woman or gay, lesbian or trans or today it would be Muslims or trans people or disabled people, we're fighting for their rights. I think it's a good thing in the sense that if you're fighting for freedom, you're supporting them to have more freedom that they have at the moment. So, if you're fighting for freedom, you're against exploitation or oppression.
We've got a couple of questions maybe.
About identity politics. I just had an interest, it's the fact that I think the categories of identity are getting proliferated more and more. I was watching a Louis Theroux documentary on polyamory, and the polyamorists were all use the language of identity to describe themselves. So they'd be like, I'm poly, that's integrated into their sense of self. I just thought it was interesting how the whole philosophical ontology about relating to identity sort of expands, and people now not only think about sexuality as an element of their identity, but also I guess like their values surrounding how they conduct their sexuality is also, and how that could just go on indefinitely, you know. But that was a side thought. But if you've got any thoughts on that, that would be interesting. But also I just wanted to know about your sort of ideas in general. So just from what you've been saying so far, it seems like you've got a clear like critical element to your ideas. So you're critical of free speech, the notion of freedom of speech as it's sort of utilized in the sort of public arena as a sort of basically a notion that doesn't change anything. It just serves liberal interests, and you tie that to identity politics. But I also heard like a positive element to what you were saying when I joined the call. So I got the notion that you wanted to expand the idea of freedom of speech, because obviously, so speech isn't a univocal concept. It can mean lots of different things. And one thing about speech is that, in a sense, speech means being heard as well. So it made me think of like freedom of the press and Chomsky on manufacturing consent, and that whole process whereby ideas that don't fit the mainstream are excluded through various different mechanisms, so that in the mainstream you can only operate within a very small framework of ideas, and if yours are outside that, then they don't get included. And in a sense, that's a denial of your freedom of speech as well. Do you have a positive concept of freedom of speech?
I remember actually what I wanted to say. It's related to what you also said, not freedom of speech yet. You said positive concept. One of the things about identity politics I wanted to think about, I'm still thinking about, is that for me, as a person who think I understand society in a more materialist way, I see identity politics as, in one way, especially because of the way that identity politics today is developed. So like you're saying, there is a lot of different identity nowadays. You know, you have now you don't have the women's rights movement. You have the Black women's right, and you have the Black lesbian women's right, and then one day you will have the Black lesbian women's right in America, and then the Black women's, you know, and it's becoming more and more like fragmented groups, and that's normal things to do because we are living in society where there is no notion of politics, but also a lot of atomizations of movements. So you have divisions. Basically, yeah, politics today is like a different identity, different groups fighting for a world that we all see as finite. Different groups will fight for their own interest, and the smaller groups will develop to be able to fight for their own little corner of the world. This is how I see it, is that we basically end up fighting each other for what we see is as little things, that resources, basically finite resources. And for me, problems with identity politics, especially for a left, for example, as a workers, we are making the analysis of a worker, or what it means working class, for example, as if it is the same thing as a lifestyle. So you will have the working class, the workers' identity, and then you have the vegetarian identity. And you're making this very important understanding society, you're making it as a simple descriptions of people's identity. If you are a working class, it's not just because it's not an identity, it's the result of your social position in society, in a capitalist society. If you're vegetarian, it's a lifestyle. But if you're all involved in identity politics, you're making this very important understanding of the social positions of a worker as if it was just simple descriptions of an individual's identity. Is that you're basically denying the importance of the structural organization of society by doing identity politics, because some social position in society has to be able to be acknowledged, to be able to fight for freedom. And if you're just making it as a subjective descriptions of individuals, then you're just forgetting all the important issue. So, for example, that's the reason why I criticize the people, you have professors nowadays, or politicians, or journalists, who goes and say, I'm a working class. And I could also say I'm a working class because I come from a working class background. A working class becomes also an identity. And this is really bad. Because for me, it's just like we are really going away from any materialist understanding of the world today. It becomes just a subjective understanding of I'm a working class and I'm a vegetarian and I'm green, or it becomes descriptions of an individual identity, and that's for me is a barrier for a movement for freedom and freedom of speech. A concept. I'm not against freedom of speech. I do support freedom of speech. I just think that for me it's like, why is everybody want to talk about freedom of speech today? Why do right wing who don't care about freedom suddenly support freedom of speech? And for me, it means that freedom of speech has the real meaning has changed, because the real meaning of freedom has changed also. So you can support freedom of speech without changing anything in society. We can say, well, yes, let's have Twitter have regulations where everybody can speak to Twitter and nothing change, because the meaning of freedom has been kind of meaningless in one way. So I still support freedom of speech or freedom of association, especially in countries where they don't have freedom of speech. You can see a difference. I mean, if you're a country where you've been killed for having a point of view, I do think it's a good thing that we're not being killed for having a point of view today in in Britain or in France or in Germany. So I do support it, but it's not enough. That's what I'm trying to say. It's only a tool for something more important than it's a tool. I see it as a tool, as a step towards. And I think today, the lefty, the one who supports freedom of speech, because a lot of lefty do not support freedom of speech at the moment, but the one who support it only see it as it becomes the end of it. It's a question of means or ends. What is the end of our fight, and what is the means towards the end? And freedom of speech for me is a means, but it's not the end. It's not my aim. It's not my objective.
Speech is all to do with communication and different. What's his name? German philosopher, really old. Habermas builds his conception of freedom and politics off communication to a large extent, rational discussion. I get your critique of freedom of speech, and I think I agree with it completely. But there's a way, I guess it's got rhetorical power to say, okay, I can hear your concept of freedom. I hear you. Freedom of speech is important, but there's a whole other dimension to it that isn't being considered in the mainstream, which is the freedom to be heard and the freedom to communicate, which isn't permitted currently in the society that we live in and by really existing capitalism. And we have to debate within a particular framework. That framework, you can give loads of different examples, but I guess there's one today. So there was like a whole hoo-ha, the big travesty, because Marcus Rashford, who's a footballer, campaigned to get free school meals for primary school and secondary school students. And obviously because they were home, they weren't getting access to that. So he campaigned for the government to help them out. And the government outsourced to a company, so a private company that distributed free school meals that were worth £5, but they were paid £30. So they basically, I guess, scammed these school kids by giving them much less than they were supposed to have. And I get the framework within that whole thing is going to operate today and tomorrow is, should the boss of Chartwell's, which is the company that distributed the food, be sacked? And that's as far as it will go, rather than saying, is there a fundamental issue with privatization and outsourcing in relation to social goods, and going deeper into the systemic flaws related to capitalism and politics. But that's connected to I see a way that could be connected to the issue of freedom of speech. If there was more freedom of speech, in a way, these things would be discussed.
Do you think so? Because yes, if we have freedom of speech, it's important to discuss it. But when you look at the past, people did fight without having a freedom of speech. So it's not as if if we don't have freedom of speech, there is nothing we can do about the world. The reason why I'm saying that is because I'm thinking of my grandmother. She didn't know how to read and write. She had not been in school. She could have said, well, I don't know how to read and write, so I can't be involved in politics, but she was involved in politics in her own way. And she didn't have freedom of speech in the sense of she didn't have any possibility of writing an article in a newspaper, but she still fought for rights and freedom. I'm always worried about people saying we have to have that, otherwise we cannot do that. So for me, freedom of speech is important, but people fight and carry on fighting without the freedom of speech. The reason I'm saying also that is because I think that democracy is being seen as more of a talking shop than anything else. It's like democracy is we have to have open discussions and meetings so we can discuss ideas, and then we can have democracy. And democracy is seen more of a big open meeting and we can all discuss ideas rather than having a sentiment, democratic sentiment. And for me, the democratic sentiment is believing that the majority of us can have a say one way or the other in how we organize ourselves. So it's not let's have all meetings and open meetings and one way or the others and then we can have endless meetings. It's about how can we fight for a movement where we really believe that most of us can participate in organizing ourselves. And I think this freedom of speech is very linked to the idea of democracy becoming just a talking. And I mean, when you talk about Brexit in Britain, for me, I was supporting Brexit, but at the end of the day, it became like democracy. We want to have open meetings. And I'm sorry, but for me, democracy is not open meetings. First of all, because we never had democracy in the world. Open meeting is not democracy. It doesn't give you the politics and the sentiment that makes us want to fight for freedom. Because for me, democracy is that. The freedom of speech is always linked to this, I see as very middle class, let's have a cup of tea and discuss ideas type of attitude. We can have a cigarette, or no, not anymore, actually, I used to be a smoker. So we can have a cup of tea and have a nice discussions about ideas. It would be good for that. Yeah, it would be good for that. Oh yeah, yes. We are all in democracy because we have open meeting. And it's not that. For me, it's reviving the willingness to fight for a world where most of us can have a say. And when you look at the revolutions in the past, the French revolutions and the American revolutions and the Haitian revolutions, for example, they had this willingness to fight for we have a say. I mean, the American Revolution started with the people, and we know it did not end up with the people, but the initial concept is we the people. We the people, we decide for us. And this is gone at the moment. This idea that we can trust each other to organize ourselves in a society that we can have more than we have today. This is gone. That's why it's easy to talk about democracy, because the meaning of democracy is gone too. Talking shop. I mean, do you really want to have a talking shop as the aim in politics? We can talk? I mean, it's not very high ambition. We can have open meetings. For me, I wouldn't have been involved in politics as a young person if people were telling me, oh, let's have open meetings. Yeah, open meetings, as a black working class, open meetings, am I going to have a job just having open meetings? You know what I mean? Is that I remember when I was young, it's not open meetings was not interesting me. It's having a good job and being free to be able to decide how it's organized. And I'm frustrated by politics. I'm sure you notice that. It's because I just think that for the last 2 years, I've been reading things that I've never read before. I've been following politics, I've been involved in politics, and I follow people's ideas, but I have never read some of the books myself. And I just discovered there is a world out there, talking world, and the reading world, where there is a lot of ideas that could be useful for us today. For example, do you know that freedom of speech had two meanings in antiquity? There was two different freedom of speech in antiquity. The rights, what did I say? The rights, this is things I discovered recently. The right to be able to, equal right of citizens to participate in public meetings, and this was called isegoria. And you have the paresia, which is license to say what one please. I'm thinking there is so much that is out there that is not discussed, because if we follow what the social media or the media is telling us, it's just a whole world is forgotten. Freedom of speech discussions is going nowhere because there is two understanding of freedom of speech. And that's the reason why you have the left arguing that why do you want to have freedom of speech, because it's just insulting black people or lesbian or gay people or trans people, because if you're insulting them, you're preventing them speaking themselves. This is the argument of protecting hate speech, yes? It's about protecting the marginalized groups. So you're saying that if you have complete freedom of speech, you can just insult some people and you can in fact marginalize most of the people. And then you have the other people who are arguing that freedom of speech, we want to have freedom of speech that we can say whatever you want. And in fact, the reason why it goes endlessly is because they have different meanings of freedom of speech. And I discovered, maybe not you, but I discovered that in antiquity, there is two different meanings of freedom of speech. The same I also discovered not long ago, that there is different meaning of freedom. Freedom from non-interference versus freedom from non-domination. The freedom to control your society and the freedom to control your private life away from the state. Very different meaning of freedom. I think this is what should be pushed.
Yeah, I was just going to take seriously those claims about this being the end content being actual material change, actual human emancipation, etc., and pick up on that point that you're kind of talking about how class identity these days is sort of performed. Like you see it kind of on kind of runways, at like Paris Fashion Week or something, like particular, working class kind of identities just turned into this like the complete, like incredibly expensive and elaborate clothing, and it all becomes very performative and postmodern. So there's this sort of idea that there's a clash of styles here, right? Material change, like dialectical materialism, whatever you want to call it, a materialist politics with our current sort of paradigm, which is a postmodern one. So with you talking earlier and Bradley mentioning how, for Marx it was the proletariat, for Mao it was the peasantry. Like, how can a material force of change emerge when there's this just complete load of fucking chaotic postmodern noise in which there doesn't really seem to be much in terms of fixed identity? Everything's performed. For you to talk then about your end, which isn't free speech, it's change, what kind of ideas are we formulating as a broad left to try and like create some sort of momentum? It seems to me that there's a sort of imminent kind of argument here about like left Unitarian sort of movement kind of thing happening.
So are you asking me how to go about it, basically?
Just to be beyond that argument of free speech. So free speech is a means; it is not the end. However, as you said, there's this, if everything's identity and everything's performative and everything is fragmented or atomized or however you want to phrase it, there needs to be some sort of Unitarian kind of movement, right? But like time and time again, leftist thinkers have been completely stumped. And, there's always that quote, we can't imagine, we can't seem to imagine the next kind of stage, in civilization. And it seems like that Fukuyama's, argument that this is the end of history seems to be coming, to fruition. It's one of those things. It's not a provocative, what's the answer? But I'm just wondering where, your kind of thought, like how that's what you're kind of thinking toward that.
I've been thinking about it, especially because, you feel very isolated because for me, I'm going away from my old network. I do not support all the left identity politics or postmodernism. So in a way, and I'm not supporting right-wing politics. So in a way, it's been always on my mind, how can I participate in building a movement for, actually I would say building movement for politics. So how can we revive politics? This is how I see it. To be honest, at the moment, I think my point of view is too intellectual and too academic in that sense. I think that we cannot just in our room build a movement. So we will have to for me, I have to be involved in different discussions or different actions or different political movement, in the sense that my idea is to be able to, how can I go and I don't have the answer. So for me, is how can I go about building a movement that reminds us that what we want is freedom, in a way, as an individuals, but also as a collective. And at the moment, I'm thinking that the way I do it is like, you should read books, you should read all the intellectuals knowledge that humanity has developed, not only in the Western world, but also in the other world. And there is a lot of the old ideas that we can use to be able to build a movement. But this, for me, is just too intellectual. It doesn't develop into, I think it's an organic thing that it has to be. And to be honest, at the moment, I don't know. As an individual, I'm trying to do research and to be able to remind people that there was a knowledge that has been forgotten. Because I think also one of the things that we have today, one of the problems is the lack of knowledge and the philistinism. So people are quite happy to go and say, I don't read books, or I don't do this, and I don't think about it because it's my feeling and I don't need to know about anything else. So I think there is also a very strong anti-intellectual movement that I am challenging. But I do not know, to be honest. For the last 2 years, I've been thinking that there is things that we have already developed. As I was thinking as humans, so I don't care whether it's a French or it's German or Chinese author. There is a lot of things that as humanity has developed that could help us to formalize, to build political movements. But I do not understand at the moment how we can go and do it on the ground. You know what I mean? I just worry that if we do it the way that I do it, it will become just like a middle class academic movement that we can have a kind of a talking shop. And I have some ideas, but I haven't worked it out. I have a lot of questions. First of all, because I also think that there is a lot of things I do not understand on the level of society. So I'm discovering this idea of the difference between civil society and the state. And I just think that the more I understand that, the more I realize there is quite a lot of things that we've been going through wrong on the level of left-wing politics. And I think that we have to go a bit further in the past to be able to start again.
It seems like those two things you mentioned are related, though. The rise of the Philistines 2.0, with, you know, people being kind of radically anti self-education or self-crit, whatever, and academics being increasingly impossible and dense to read. I mean, there is this profound irony that all of the literature surrounding Marx for such a long period of time seems to be almost completely, you know, unconsumable if you haven't had a university background and you're not like clued up with this whole kind of vocabulary and all this sort of thing. So it seems like those two things are really closely related that you mentioned.
People found it easy to criticize academic. And I have to say that before I started to do my second PhD, you know, so I'm an academic, talking shop things. Before I started to do my PhD again, I was quite happy to criticize the academic and saying that they have very heavy, horrible way of talking. And I have to say that when you read some papers, I don't bother, I have to say. I think for me, I start from the idea that if you're making a language so dense, I mean, if you don't speak very well English, I understand, because it's the same for me. If you're an native speaker and you make the language so dense that most of us cannot understand, it means that you don't want to be understood. So I don't bother with those things. And maybe they have good ideas, but if you don't want normal people to understand you, I'm not interested in you. But what I was surprised when I've been doing my research is that there was a lot of academics discussions that are really interesting and not necessarily in a dense way. So I'm not anti-academic as such anymore, not as much as I used to be. There is, when I did the discussion on identity politics has been discussed in academia in the 1990s. Before I started to do the research, when you listen to the newspaper, you had decided that identity politics started I'm talking about left identity politics, yeah? So because most people see identity politics as left, you know, the black and the woman. So I don't agree with that. The way the people discuss left identity politics today is as if it was a new thing. When the academic has been discussing left identity politics and identity politics since the 1990s, and it becomes much more important after 21st century, basically, in the public. And when you read academic discussions on identity politics, you can see the different people trying to understand how it works out. I mean, some people agree with me in the sense of identity politics started in the past. Other people see identity politics as only the left. Some people agree that, you know, I'm not anti-academic as such. If you have to look, you have really important ideas in academia that are not discussed at the moment in public, but they are there.
Hi, did you have a question you wanted to?
It might have already been covered. I'm not an academic, by the way, but so I guess I totally agree with you in terms of its freedom of speech is hypothetical if you haven't got freedom from exploitation or poverty or class oppression. Totally agree with you on that point. And I guess what I was thinking of, though, in terms of when you say freedom, what does freedom, because also that is, you know, my thing, that's mainly my thing that I'm aiming from. How do I become free enough to live the life that I choose to want to live under this system that wants to keep me down, that wants to keep me, you know, in a 17-hour fucking day job and not allowing me to do my art and not, do you know what I mean? It's about having that freedom to have a choice. Freedom of choice, or to choose my life, yeah, which I assume is what most of us are aiming for people in the world. And I guess for me, it's about deciding what does that freedom look like, and also where does responsibility come in from that. And I think responsibility is quite an old-fashioned word, but with freedom also comes responsibility, you know. Freedom can also be seen as a very kind of liberal kind of thing or capitalist thing. Freedom of choice is could be a very capitalist thing, and freedom to destroy the planet if you want to because it's making money.
One of the things I was fighting for, and it's related to the article on the FGM that you mentioned before to me, is individual autonomy. So responsibility also and autonomy. The argument is that basically today, one of the barriers to change today is that we do not believe that people can be autonomous. So basically, we attack individual autonomy in the sense that we think that people are too idiotic to make decisions for themselves. Responsibility and autonomy. So I think responsibility and autonomy is important in a similar way as freedom of speech. Although if you want to fight for anybody is involved in politics, will have to be, do you mean individual responsibility or collective responsibility?
No, I mean individual and collective. I mean responsibility in lots of ways, whether that's, and of course it relates to freedom of speech, because responsibility, if you have freedom of speech, what are you using it for? Also in terms of collectively, you know, and I think there's something in those two. If you're talking about freedom, you also have to talk, there also is, how does your freedom and the decisions that you make with that freedom, how does that then impact on other people? Because we're a collective, we're not individuals, we bounce off each other and our actions impact on each other.
Yes, but in a sense, it's related to the way that you see, so it's always connected to the way that we see human. All my ideas is based on the idea that people can make a decision for themselves. So in a sense of individuals can be responsible for their own actions, can be judged and can be responsible for it. So of course, and one of the reasons why most people will not be involved in politics or will not support democracy is that they are believing that humans are not cannot be responsible for their own action or determined by something else. So I think it's a big discussion. My politics is based on a very particular way of looking at humanity. I do not believe, this is I suppose a basis thing that I should have mentioned. I do not believe that humans are determined. So for me, politics, and if you support politics and if you support freedom, you have to have a view of human that is not what is seen most of the time today. So humans that can be in control of their own destiny. So responsible for their actions and not determined, I'm talking about causally determined by what's happening in the world, be determined by the world, but also can control their own destiny and control the world around them. So it's a view of human as autonomous agents in what the people are saying, in the sense of, for example, as a Black person, as a woman, as a French person, I have things that will influence me. Well, as somebody else living abroad, I live in Germany, so I live in a foreign country and things will have influence on me. But I believe that as human, like any of us, we also have the possibility of going away from this determination. You know what I mean? So it's linked, the responsibility is linked to that. I think that human has the ability, for me, that's why freedom is so important. We are not just animals. We have the capacity to understand the world and to control it and to control our own destiny. If you don't believe that, you cannot be involved in politics in the sense of what I mean by politics, because, I don't know, a dog would not fight for freedom. You know what I mean? I mean, I have a dog and I love dogs, but I can't see my dog fighting for freedom, because he doesn't have the notions of autonomy. I mean, some people do things, but I don't. So we as humans have a special ability that nobody else has, nothing else has. And this ability is to be able to understand the world rationally and to control it, to go away from the determinations of the world and of ourselves. What I also mean by freedom is that freedom is not something that is specific, like, you know, this is freedom, and then we reach freedom, and then we are free. The freedom will always be something that it will change with us. What we mean by freedom will change with how humans evolve.
Yeah, it's a bit like, I was just thinking of Marx's, in the Political Economic Manuscripts, where he talks about how senses change and how your desire, how, I don't know, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but it's like how what you're aiming for changes and who you are kind of changes.
At the moment, I'm looking at freedom in the sense of fighting to change society.
Yeah.
And then if you have a society that is more free than it is today, the meaning of freedom will have changed, in the sense that we as human, when we change the world, we change ourselves. So what it means to be a human being in the past is not the same as it is today. When I did the research on identity politics, I also looked at some of the discussions on identity and some of the discussions about the self. And at the moment, people seem to look at identity and the self as something which is fixed. But throughout human history, we define ourselves, and then by defining ourselves, we're also changing ourselves. And the definitions of human nature is also changing. So it's not something that is fixed, it's historically specific. It also means that the notion of freedom and what it means to be free will also be historically specific. And the same as what we need to be free or what we need to be happy will also be historically specific, because we do change ourselves. We change the world and we change ourselves.
Do you think that freedom at all, freedom to exist and freedom of expression, both individually and on a societal level, can exist with abstract threat, such as the climate crisis that we exist, where a pressing need for collective organization and action become more important than potentially our current ideas and individual and potentially societal ideas of freedom kind of existing in that sense? Can freedom essentially exist with that sort of abstract pressing threat? Or do we submit to our kind of hierarchy of needs? Does freedom disappear on that hierarchy of needs whenever we combat threat as a societal or an individual sense?
I don't see freedom as, I think the way you describe it is more of a thing than that I understand it. It's not like we have freedom and we don't have, and then we don't have freedom if something happens. What I'm saying is that the way we understand freedom today is specific. I have an understanding of freedom which is related to the society as a whole, as a total society. So for me, you could say you being free to choose, if you're free to choose the meal for your kids, you can be free. But is it freedom? Is it what we want as humans? Is it enough? This is how I see it. And at the moment, people see freedom too much in an individual way, because we are social beings. When you look at freedom today, it's only individual freedom that is being discussed.
I suppose from my point of view of freedom, I see freedom not as a human thing, but also an emancipation of an ecological system of humans interacting with both each other and their environment and their existence on the planet as a whole, and with animals and everything. It's kind of like a very complete sense. And whenever we have, even on an individual level of freedom, that, you're saying that you don't agree with freedom being this individualism sense, our freedom to exist as a society and look for the emancipation, I suppose, for human rights and needs to be able to be met and things like that, cannot even exist with existential threat or abstract threat.
It really depends on your definition. For me, I don't have freedom today. So even if I had freedom of speech, and even if there is no existential even if there is no threat to my existence necessarily, doesn't mean that I have freedom, because I live in society where I have to sell my labor to be able to live, for example, or I live in society where I do not have a say in what's happening around me. So I would say that it's how do we define what do we want in one way. I don't understand. It goes to my definitions of freedom in the sense of, for me, it has to be related to the society. You cannot have individual freedom without freedom from everybody else, freedom for all of us. So I am supporting individual freedom because I am supporting society where individuals, human beings, can develop. That's the ultimate aim. But it is not happening without changing society, because we're also social beings. What we are is related to what society is. We represent society, and society also makes us. So individual freedom cannot exist. For me, individual freedoms mean nothing in a society where all of us are not free.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like, in addition to my question, I suppose it touches a little bit more on the idea is like freedom is like the pinnacle of society in that sense, of our abstract, like we deconstruct what we have and we build our free society. But in the hierarchy of needs, where it comes to kind of things that threat those other things, in my mind, I suppose I see freedom as being completely eroded just because of the need to kind of exist, to fix those things in order to exist and to fulfill our need in other ways. So the concept of freedom then kind of disappears just because you have to act in an animalistic sense.
Okay. Basically, you're saying, in one way, you're saying that if we have needs, for example, in some people needs to have a house, for example, if we have those needs, can we be free? That's what you're saying, something like that.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I personally think of humanity as never free in a societal sense, because we are then continually reliant on either our need to feed beyond our ability to kind of be extreme extremely, reductionist, to remove humanity to our complete self-reliance and freedom to be like hunter-gatherer type.
Yeah, but our needs has changed. Yes. So the way I see society is that a human society has to be, we always have to understand society, for me, the same way as Marx does it, I would do it. It's a level of how we reproduce a society, how we produce. So we always have to have a productions of things. But a human needs change historically. It's, for example, a mobile phone is a need, it's a human need today. And people call it luxury. I think it's a need because it's the way that we have developed, it may becomes a need. And eating, we may always want to eat, but the way we eat has changed. The way we socialize has changed. So I'm not talking about freedom as we're going to be free from wanting to eat or whatever. I'm talking about freedom in the sense of developing what it means to be human. And what it means to be human for me is related to our reason, our capacity to go above animal characteristic. So it's not eating or sex or whatever as, the things that animals do as something that is particularly human. Animals have it. It's for me what is freedom is related to what is specific to human, our reason, creativity, our ability to control ourselves, our ability to determine our future. That is what I mean by that. And at the moment, the society that we live is preventing most of us, actually is preventing all of us from developing that ability, those ability, the ability to go above animal needs. I mean, it's important, but it's not what makes us human. I make a difference between what makes us human and what makes us part of nature, part of the animal kingdom. And for me, freedom is related to what makes us human, what makes us kind of further than what animals are. So if our needs, we always will have needs and desire, but the need and desire will develop according to society's development. And today, I think that in the society that we have today, this development is being restricted. And that's what I want to have freedom, but not freedom in the sense of this is, we are free. That is it. It's the end of history. There is no freedom end of history, but freedom in the sense of we can further develop ourselves. I do not know what will happen after, but how can we go above what we have today? This is only what I see.
So I was just wondering what you thought about, I suppose, issues like, say, for example, like the Assange trial, things like that, or involved in sort of conventional sort of legal free speech activism, I suppose. So I'm not necessarily the way it's talked about in the media, but in the sense that either challenging certain laws which might seem to inhibit free speech or certain trials like the Assange trial. I mean, how do you relate those issues to your broader conception of freedom? So that's, for example, there was the Covert Criminal Intelligence Bill, which was passed in the UK recently, which allows or was seen as giving not just MI5 but a whole range of government institutions power to act above the law. And so there was a kind of question about whether that allowed forms of rape, murder and stuff by the state. And so, of course, that does at some level pose a threat to free speech. So you could also talk about like the way, so for example, free speech zones are applied in America, that would seem to inhibit free speech. And then you can sort of see how something like the trial of Assange can be an affront to free speech. So you can see those things as kind of free speech issues. They seem to fit much closer to what you might call the liberal model. I'm just wondering how you'd relate those kind of concerns with your sort of broader.
I support, it's liberal values. I'm not against all liberal values or rights. So if there is a campaign for free speech or against hate speech, which I do disagree with, for example, I disagree with hate speech laws, then if there is a campaign against hate speech law, I will support the people in France, for example, or the Gilets jaunes fighting for the right to protest. So I will support them fighting against, I know more on that level than the law that you mentioned in England. In France, they wanted to have, and they still want, a law, they call it Loi Sécurité Globale, a security law, where basically the people and the press will not be able to have video online of policemen face identification. So you will not, the argument is that somehow to protect the police, you have to have a law preventing people posting any way of identifying the police. But if you follow the discussion about the Gilets jaunes, there was a lot of police violence. So basically it was a law saying that the police will be able to do what they want without the press or ordinary people able to fight against police violence. So of course I will support the protest. I supported the protest against this law because the civil liberties and rights are very important to defend. It helps us to fight for something better. I mean, like I said, I don't want to be in a world where if I open my mouth, I would be killed or being arrested. I mean, we can be arrested even now, but I don't want to have a society where we're going to be having even less rights and less civil liberties. I do not support rights and liberties as the end of my things, but I will support rights and liberties as useful for the ordinary people to have some kind of political power to be able to defend themselves. But political power is not enough. That's what I see the world as, both political world, but also economic and social world. So fighting for political power, yes, but it's not enough. But definitely, I will support any campaign who challenge authoritarian laws. I mean, the right to protest is important. Actually, that's the reason why I don't agree with cancel culture, the notion of cancel culture, because I think there is censorship. I think there is a lot of censorship in society, but I think the cancel culture, the notion of cancel culture, is being promoted by specific groups of people. For me, it hides the important problems of society in the sense of cancel culture. If you look at who's promoting it, they are targeting a lot of, for example, professors being cancelled or journalists being cancelled. They're only highlighting some specific cases of censorship, forgetting all the other cases of censorship. So prevent in England is not being discussed, part of the cancel culture. Cancel culture is so wide that it has no meaning. It's being used by anybody for anything that they want to use. And most of the people using it is like, oh no, a professor has been cancelled because he did some talk and he's been cancelled. At the same time that they're discussing cancel culture, there is no discussions about the laws preventing people protesting. And if you prevent somebody protesting, you're also, in one way, cancelling them. You're preventing people to have a say. How can you talk about cancel culture when you're and censorship when you're avoiding a lot of the example of censorship that ordinary people are suffering from? It's too much of a political tool by the right, basically.
I was going to read this quote from Trump where he said, he criticised it on the 4th of July 2020. He criticised cancel culture for the way it was driving people out of their jobs, shaming dissenters, and demanding total submission from anyone who disagrees. This, he says, is the very definition of totalitarianism and is completely alien to our country and our values and has absolutely no place in the United States of America. And so he later goes on to say, we want freedom and open debate, not speech codes and cancel culture. In saying that, and I just sort of think about whether he is, in some sense, a free speech advocate or not.
Trump being a free speech advocate. It's the same as the people when Samuel Paty was killed because he was criticizing Islam. I support actually still the right for teachers or anybody to criticize Islam. But the discussions about the Samuel Paty, especially when after Macron said that he's fighting for the right to free speech, for me it's just an example of how the free speech things can be used by people who have no willingness to fight for free speech. We're talking about Macron, who is attacking the right to protest, attacking the freedom of speech of ordinary people, attacking the life of ordinary people. He can still go around and say he supports free speech, the same as Trump. I mean, since when does Trump support free speech? They can use those concepts as a way of saying that they are concerned by, I suppose, ordinary people. For me, it's what do you mean by freedom of speech if you're Trump, Macron? Do we have the same meaning? And I think it's never discussed. What do they mean by it? So Trump have laws or can support laws and regulations that attack groups of people and still go and next day and said, I think cancel culture is a bad thing. So I was so angry with Macron because people in England were saying, oh yeah, Macron is very good, he's fighting against terrorism and he's for freedom of speech. At the same time as was arresting, his government, not him, but the government, the state in France was arresting different people who disagree with, there were some kids, silly kids, who basically saying it was good things for Samuel Paty to die. I mean, it's just a really silly things, but you know that some kids will say those horrible stuff. Those kids or the people were arrested at the same time as the government was introducing loi sécurité globale. So you can just go and say, I support freedom of speech because it's terrible to have this history teacher to be killed in a horrible way. And at the same time, he's supporting laws and regulations who goes against it. So what do we mean by freedom of speech? What do they mean by freedom of speech? And for me, the discussion is always in a very shallow way. So somebody said, I support freedom of speech, and then we all like, oh yes, this is good. Nobody asked, what do you mean by it? So I mean, Trump supporting freedom of speech. I mean,
but it's almost like you can use free speech kind of arguments to censor people, because you can say, well, but these people over here are like a real threat to free speech, therefore we need to find a way of censoring them. So you could say, well, people that are, so in this context, we're talking about Islam or different groups that in the Samuel Paty case. So then you can think about who's a potential threat. And I think when people talk about cancel culture, they're talking about particular kind of academic traditions that might be a threat to free speech that we might want to then censor. Sometimes I feel like it can flow from an argument that looks like it's in favour of free speech to then how do we censor people that are a threat to this free speech.
But I think it also shows how the freedom of speech, the meaning of it is gone. I don't bother to discuss it anymore because for me it's nothing to do with the original freedom of speech. Some people will support freedom of speech until you say the wrong thing. So basically you're saying freedom of speech for me and my friends, but if you're saying something that I don't agree, then you don't have freedom of speech. This is nothing to do with freedom of speech. So even that is just easy to understand, that it's nothing to do with freedom of speech. It's basically speech for the ideas that we agree. So it's the same level as some left-wing people who argue that they support freedom of speech, except for Nazi or for racist, for anti-trans. They don't support freedom of speech because they're saying we support somebody to have a point of view until they're saying the things that I don't like. Actually, this is also it was easy for France because at the same time as they were saying freedom of speech, they were curtailing the freedom of speech of Muslims. But in France, since I think 2010, or I can't remember, they introduced a higher law, as France itself, for people who are damaging the flag. So you support freedom of speech, we all support freedom of speech. Nothing is sacred, except when you disagree with the French flag. This is not freedom of speech, is it? So I think a lot of the freedom of speech, when you look at it, and it's always argued actually on the level of responsibility. It's like you have freedom of speech, but you have to be responsible for the consequences of what you're saying. So for me, if you are supporting freedom of speech, you support the idea that anybody can say what they want. The point is to argue against the point that somebody said. I'm also against hate law for that reason. If we start curtailing one group of people, who are going to be curtailed next? Who's going to decide who is going to be curtailed? So either you support free speech or you don't support free speech. I support complete free speech, what somebody called absolutist free speech. But at the same time, I do not think it's the ultimate aim, but I think that either you have free speech or you don't. If you start deciding who have a free speech, then you don't have free speech. But then again, we also know that we don't have free speech in this society because you can be arrested for damaging the flag, or you can be arrested for saying something against the government, or you can be arrested for a lot of different reasons. So we never had freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is an ideal, not a reality. I don't support the position that you can decide what should be said, because who's going to decide? It's our society, groups of people, the state, Bezos. There will be some people deciding what other people should hear and say. Curtailment, all the laws and regulation, not. But 2 years ago, somebody was saying to me, you cannot have freedom and equality in the same place. And I think in one way you could say it's really related to the liberal things. Freedom of speech in a way cannot be attained in the society that we have today. Because you could also argue that if you have freedom of speech, it can also be used to prevent other people to have freedom as such. Freedom of speech is also, when you demand freedom of speech, you also see the restrictions that we have, the limitations of those liberal values. That's why I support them, but at the same time, for me, they are not the ultimate aim because they have very strong limitations to what we can ask for the future. And freedom of speech is that. How far can we go with freedom of speech?
I was just wondering whether or not the reason freedom of speech has become such a thing is because of social media and because now people have unfiltered platforms. And I wonder if the thing is not about curtailing people's speech, but actually the responsibility of corporations in platforming. And that's maybe an easier thing, because it's, if you think about, things like Twitter and stuff like that, they are publishing, they're like a publishing house. So what is their responsibility? I think that's another question really. And as that organization, what do they choose to support and not support?
Yeah, but then again, for me, it goes to the issue of how we organize the platforms, Google and Facebook and Twitter, on the reflections of the society that we are. So they have the power to curtail a lot of rights and civil liberties. and we have to challenge them, but they are just an aspect of our life today. So I don't want to focus, to be honest, I don't want to focus on them only, because I think it's avoiding the bigger issue. If we're not curtailed by Twitter, we are curtailed by something else. For me, it's part of a bigger issue. And if we concentrate too much on Twitter and Facebook and how we're going to regulate them, we are forgetting what, for me, is forgetting what is important, and how can we achieve a bigger freedom than just having regulations for Twitter and Facebook. And
well, they're private companies, so I guess they regulate themselves to a certain degree, aren't they? I mean, they're private corporations, so. As
a worker, let's think about it. Who has been regulating our life? The people are losing their jobs, the people having low wages. We've been regulated. The fact that Twitter and Facebook are cutting freedom of speech is becoming a big issue. And the fact that somebody has 100 billion euro or pounds or dollar in their account, it doesn't seem to be too much of a threat for people. But then again, if you have that much power, you're already curtailing and deciding what's happening. So I don't understand this focus on Twitter and Facebook when we're already in society where most of us have no power. We have no power. So whether it's Facebook curtailing my free speech, or the state, or somebody else who's going to be regulating Facebook and curtailing my free speech, how can we fight to be able to have this power to organize ourselves, to govern ourselves? And it's not by just fighting against Twitter and Facebook. We have to ask for more freedom, but they are not the only, they're just a reflections of what society is. The power has always been in the hands of a minority. This is what capitalism is, yes?
Yes, sure.
And we never had democracy. So when we look at all the democratic country, and we look at the laws, that's what another things I want to do, is all the laws has been introduced from the beginning, American and the French. If we look at all the laws, a lot of the laws were introduced very early to curtail democracy, to curtail the power of the people to decide. And so I'm supposed to forget about that and concentrate on Facebook, who banned Trump, Twitter banning Trump. I mean, I don't follow all those. Maybe I'm wrong, but I see it as if I'm supposed to follow what the public discussions is concerned about. And I don't think this public discussion is in my interest. I think it's in interest of groups of elites, and it's not concerning what I want to do in politics. And what I want to do in politics is to fight for freedom, and to be worried about Twitter and Facebook 24/7 is not going to help me understanding and changing society, basically. This is how I see it. I just think it's different groups fighting for political power. And this is how I see it. And it doesn't change the positions of my mother has no more right, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or the state challenging Trump. She still has to work, and she still has to, doesn't change anything.
I suppose there is a question about who's easiest to fight. So I suppose that the bigger a monopoly becomes, it might be harder to fight them.
Why is it harder to fight them than?
Well, they gain more power than if you have sort of smaller corporations or whatever. I
personally don't think that they have the power, but it's not in their interest it's not in their interest of showing themselves as being anti people, basically.
I feel like it's a bit reductive to segment the the goings on of private corporations, communications platforms, and then the fact that we need to kind of engage with government, regulators, whatever. I mean, these things, they're completely in cahoots and so kind of interlinked now. They represent two sides of the same coin of power, right? Power over working people, as you say. But the issue I have is with this absolutist sort of defense of free speech, of never curtailing, is that it seems on a material level completely impossible to change things where there exists not even necessarily Twitter, which is a platform people use, but for me it's these newspapers which have these huge audiences, which we often underestimate, as younger generations certainly underestimate. There's still huge audiences of print media that is shaping the argument, as Rob said, that is dictating the lines between which speech can occur. It's restricting the argument. And if we kind of resign ourselves to always protecting the speech of these platforms, these very carefully calculated tactical moguls who wish to continue the subjugation of labour under power, then I feel like it's almost an impossible war. It's quite easy to imagine some dystopian situation where that concentration becomes even more pure and any kind of radicalism is completely stamped out. I mean, it's already looking fairly dire in terms of actually materially changing things. A lot of times in revolutionary periods, revolutionary underclasses have attacked the printing presses. They've attacked the very outlets that have been distorting the view of social reality. And so I feel like having an absolutist view is really hard, at least from my perspective, untenable. But the risk then becomes you get accused of being a dirty communist, etc., because you wish to restrict the media or whatever. But it seems like media language only becomes more vitriolic as years go by. And it's just that kind of elaboration, or I think Rob's point earlier, like how can you have a discussion? How can you have a voice when you're constantly being bombarded and unconsciously persuaded by this propaganda that is nearly always anti-labor and pro-corporations, political power, whatever. That's kind of my concern with an absolutist sort of protection of free speech a priori, whatever you want to call it.
I don't know if you understand the point. In that case, in the one where it's not having platform which is important, it's having the ideas being promoted. Yes, this is what you're saying. So, yeah, because even if Twitter and Facebook is widely open, that you can have Trump on Twitter, it doesn't mean that ideas that helps ordinary people will be promoted, because they are not.
Totally, yeah. The very ideas that are being kind of recycled on Twitter and Facebook often are like direct quotations or bastardizations of news media points, talking points. It's immigrants that are the problem. It's not the fact that, you have an untenable socioeconomic system that can't survive or only survives, due to kind of the pain it kind of causes and stuff. It's like, as long as those talking points are being posited as fact and then being recycled as Billy whoever on Twitter, spouting some sort of, kind of aggressive shit. It's rare that opinion's been formulated because of his day-to-day life and his experience of material conditions. It's nearly always because he's got it from some sort of newspaper, or do you know what I mean? Like grand narrative. So how do you deal with these kind of issues? The issue of a media that seems so out of hand and so stacked against any sort of idea of leftist change. Like how do you deal with that if we constantly have to fight for their right to exist? I want to fight for their right not to exist, replace it with, some sort of media that actually represents, working people and the struggle for human emancipation that you talk about.
I don't think any time in history did radical left ideas had it easy. I mean, I don't think there was lots of newspaper discussing the right of workers in the mainstream media. So in a way, the radical politics had to be developed amongst people who wanted to develop radical politics. So the fact that the mainstream politics, the mainstream media today, and actually most of the social media has nothing to do with left-wing politics. To be involved in radical politics is the most difficult things you could do. It is much easier to follow any politics that you have society today, the Labour, the Conservative, keep the status quo, than to develop a politics that will challenge the real status quo. To be involved in radical politics is to be isolated and to have a hard life all throughout your life. And I think most of the people who are involved in the radical politics, at the end of the day, will end up give up, because we are talking about a status quo, a way of organizing a society which is so strong, and then we want to change that. So there will be nothing easy, whether you have the media supporting us or not. It will never be easy. So it's the hardest politics that you could have, is to have radical left-wing politics. Even if we have the media which is against us. I don't know if you know, the Gilets jaunes was organized through social media. So most of the medias in France had no discussions about the original organization of the Gilets jaunes. I don't know if you know what I mean by Gilets jaunes. The Gilets jaunes organized themselves in France through social media. The first demonstration and other demonstration, and even the law against security global, is done through social media. Of course, social media, it depends on platforms, but then again, platforms can be built, yes, if we wanted, technically, it's only a technical barrier. It's not a political barrier. The barrier that we have is a political barrier. It's an intellectual barrier. We do not have intellectual, radical left-wing politics today. And that is what we need to develop. And we can discuss the technical, how we platform and media and social media, but I think what we need is the politics and the intellectual movement. And I think that can be done with people. I mean, I suppose with friends and amongst people, it's something that can be built organically with different groups of people.
Yeah, totally. I think my point is that something inhibiting that happening, that organization, is just the mobilization of so many media, like centrist, liberal, kind of cultural right wing, whatever, there's arguably no left kind of media, like mass media represented, owned by somebody with a big readership or whatever in Britain anymore. I mean, all the socialist newspapers have died out pretty much, or are on their last legs and are like 10 pages long, and half of it's asking for donations, etc. Right? So it's less about the organization. I totally agree that it has to be some sort of material organization, but it's almost like it conceptually can't happen as long as people are constantly fed with disinformation that any kind of left organization, they're terrorists, they kind of want to destroy society, they want to do this, blah, 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 blah. So it's more like, do the protections of free speech extend to private capitalists who are using all their resources to prevent the type of political mobilization that you're talking about? That's what I'm...
Yeah, but do you want to give up?
No. That is
No,
exactly
but you're right. For me, it's like, I mean, I've been involved in politics for 25 years, but not the same politics. But I've never been involved in politics that is popular. So you're isolated all your life and you feel isolated and it's hard.
Isn't that a defeatist attitude rather than mine, though? That's what I wonder.
No, I'm not, some people say I'm not an optimist by nature because I'm still involved in politics. But no, I'm saying that for me, it is hard politics to be able to develop because we have to develop notions and ideas that go against the mainstream. And the mainstream will not allow us to be able to develop an ideas that goes against the status quo. Originally, people will have to be isolated and will have to fight against a lot of obstacles. I just think that at the moment, we are in a world where any radical left-wing politics will be really hard to develop. We will have to find ways of doing it more technically and politically, but for me, I'm more interested in the political intellectual developments because we have to see politics as convincing people. So even if people read a newspaper and media, people are convinced by what they see around themselves. Yeah, so they don't believe the media and the newspaper just because it's what they read. They link it to what their life. Yes, but if you have an alternative point of view,
I think I do have a slightly alternative point of view because I know firsthand plenty of people who base their political ideologies on the media they're exposed to, and a lot of them don't have personal experience with, I know people who are kind of anti-migrant, etc., except they probably haven't really met any kind of migrants in their lives, you know what I mean? There's no actual direct experience. They're being fed a byline, like a media byline, and they're basing their entire political identities around it. I think I hold that maybe at a higher esteem, and I'm more scared of it and challenged by it and think that might be one of the first obstacles. And I agree that it's going to be, it's extremely difficult to organize in modernity. I totally agree with that point. But I feel like part of the reason why it's so difficult is because of these, established funded entities just constantly manipulating a political discussion, and they almost need to be sort of overcome, maybe not in an insurrectionary way. I'm almost I don't know. I mean, it's a tricky one,
Are you sort of saying you're not really that keen on fighting free speech from Murdoch or something like that? That's pretty...
Yeah, basically, the very idea of a free press or freedom of speech it's used against people who actually need to still earn personal freedom by people who have long built up their fortunes and are building a wall around themselves. They're doing the exact opposite.
But that isn't really free speech, is it? What you're describing, those media outlets, I can't really see them as free speech because it feels so constructed and so controlled. And so it's not just somebody ranting an opinion or something. Controlled and capitalist control. We might get told this is free speech.
Right, yeah. I suppose it's more that they always kind of wheel that out whenever they get called out for said this that's factually wrong. They say, well, actually, no. I mean, if you look at it from this direction, this is...
That's... You're muted somehow, I don't know.
Probably my computer telling me to shut up.
You're right. It's about alternative. I looking at for my life. I've been with groups of people throughout my political life, and I was sure that I was right, and I was sure of my point of view. And then I started to do my own research, and then I saw other point of view, and I was convinced by other point of view. And I think it's about alternative. It's about developing. I mean, maybe I'm still seeing in a very liberal way, but I just think that we are rational human beings. And if you can convince people that there is other alternative way of looking at the world, this is how it's going to do. For example, the discussions about immigrants, at the moment, actually even identity politics. The discussion about immigrants and identity politics is that people, when they have grievance, when they're angry about the world, today the argument is that we are living in a world which is very finite. This is a very strong argument that we are in one earth. Everything is very finite, so there is only a certain amount of resources, and then we have to fight for it. And the immigrants are taking some of the resources away from the natives. This is an argument that is very strong, because at the moment there is no alternative to saying, actually, no, the world that we have today is not finite. What it means to be a resource can change, has changed historically. But we have to develop the arguments to be able to convince people that the way that is being presented is only one alternative and there is another alternative. And at the moment, this this is missing. For example, on the issue of race, a lot of people will say, even today, will say, well, I have no problems with, different people from different races, but at the same time, there is a very strong argument that somehow we're still separated from the different groups of people, and we have to basically fight for our different interests. For me, it's about alternative view of the world, and at the moment, we need to build an alternative view of the world to be able to convince people. And one of the big problems today compared to in the past is that even if we had identity politics from the right from a long time, we had universal politics. And actually, I agree with, I took that ideas from Walter Ben Michael, because his argument is that in the past you had ideology, and it's true. We had ideology, and ideology was based on universal politics, in a sense that when you were a communist or when you were a capitalist supporter, you had the visions of the world that was not dependent on who you were. You had the visions of the world saying a communist society or a capitalist society will be good for humanity. So it was a universal politics that they were supporting, fighting for. Today, there is no visions of the world of what will be good for all of us. There is only visions of what will be good for British, French, woman, black, trans, whatever. And so it means that the alternative point of view that we have today doesn't exist, because there is also no visions of what could be good and what could be an alternative to what we have today. That's why I'm really against identity politics in that sense, is that there is no sense of what possible society can we create that will be good regardless of your nationality, your sexuality, your sex, your gender. And at least in the past, even if there was identity politics from some corners, there was still an understanding that you could create a world where all of us could live either under capitalism or under communism. Today, even there is no supporters of capitalism. I mean, most people agree, live in society, but they don't say, oh, capitalism is best for us. So this is what is missing, is the alternative vision, alternative political aim. Actually, for me, there is no politics. This is how I read it again. There is no politics today. That's why we have to build a political movement. I'm optimistic maybe, but I just think that we have so much already. It's just a question of trusting ourselves, basically trusting ourselves to develop something that is further than what we read in the media, and people will be convinced. I mean, if you show them that it's not the immigrants, it's the way, for example, the way that we organize our money or finances, or it's the way we organize. If we have the correct arguments, people will be convinced. At the end of the day, all my politics is based on the idea that we are rational human beings. Not rational in the sense that we don't have emotions, and emotion is not important, but rational in the sense that we can understand. And anybody in this world, a Chinese or French or English, can understand the same ideas. That's what's good about humanity, is that anybody from this world can understand an idea, and that gives us the possibility to change it. We are rational in that sense, not in the sense of only reason is important, but rational in the sense that we can understand and change. And we have to base our politics on that belief. If you believe that the media change people's point of view and there is nothing we can do, then you end up being the same kind of left-wing ideas that we have in the past. The new left and a lot of the ideas of the 60s and whatever, they were arguing that somehow people were influenced by the media and they were basically consumerism. Somehow it's the fault of the people where they were so happy with capitalism, they don't want to change it. In a way, there was kind of left-wing politics blaming the people themselves, despite the fact that the left had no argument to convince people, but they blame the people themselves. I think that I'm not saying that every single individual of this world are rational individual, but I'm saying that human as such or rational human beings can be convinced. And if they can be convinced, we have to build alternative view.
I agree.
I was just wanting to add something to that. What I find could be a big challenge is this concept that we live in a post-truth world at the moment, and rationality is very easily eroded in that situation. So I guess in order to reach that point of trusting humanity with rationality, and I think, on a very base level, people are rational and people are kind and people are generally quite good. But when you're tackling this idea of post-truth or propaganda to such an extent, which does kind of come back to the media mogul kind of empire thing, but it has infiltrated our lives through social media so much and the way we construct our social interactions. And I personally have a lot of experience in tackling people who are post-truth, and it becomes very difficult to cultivate rationale. So how do you think we can cultivate that freedom with that like post-fact, post-truth world.
I don't agree with this post-truth and post-fact and post-whatever, this. People always put it. The reason is because I was reading the history of race, and if you look at what they were saying in the media, I could say, well, that was nothing to do with fact. For me, race is not a scientific category. Despite that, we are still living in a world with a racial view. So racial thinking undermines pretty much everything that we live in the world. So we're living in a world where the scientific category doesn't exist. Race scientific category doesn't exist. So race has, in one way, could have no meaning in that sense. But we're still living in a world, you could say, with the things that which is not true. So you could say, well, we've been post-truth for a long time. And also, when you look at the things that you've been taught at school, for example, I grew up with the idea that nos ancêtres sont les Gaulois, so I was memory of my childhood. Basically, the things that you were taught at school was what the French elite wanted to teach all the French future citizens, so that they will have a certain point of view of the world. So, supporting France being the great nations and that kind of thing. So you could say that there was no truth in that also, because a lot of the things has been shown as being completely made up. There is no more truth or falsity than it is in the past. I think it's who's promoting the ideas at the moment. Which kind of groups do you want to support? How do you base your knowledge and your truth on? And I think there is different groups of people challenging what they mean by truth and what they mean by knowledge. But I don't think there is any more false ideas that there was in the past.
Yeah, I think the difference now, in my opinion, of that kind of idea is the fact that we have, particularly in the United Kingdom, I don't know what it's like in France or across a lot of the rest of Europe, but particularly in the United Kingdom, there is the erosion of society in the built individual, and that promotes the kind of concept of the echo chamber and the, post-truth in inverted commas bubble of lack of critical thinking. And I think looking at rationale and humans as rational people, we rely a little bit more on this idea of being exposed to a wide variety of different things, a wide variety of thought in order to develop that critical thought. But in these echo chambers that have started to develop, particularly with individualism, for the past 30, 40 years, that have been really cultivated, particularly in the UK, I think there is an erosion of that rationale, and I just wonder what is the best way to kind of tackle that, in a sense of like kind of being able to develop rationale again,
Is there erosion? I mean, I agree with you that we are more atomized. There is the old collectivity that we have in the past doesn't exist. So a lot of the political ideas that people have is not based on, for example, their social position. So you can have a working class supporting a very right-wing, anti-working class point of view, and then you can have the liberal or very lefty middle class, so you have, or even a very lefty upper class, so you have a very atomized world. But I think it's a very different thing than saying that there is no rational. I mean, people are still rational. It's just that the ideas that are being promoted are necessarily things that you don't think is the best idea. So, for example, the idea that what people are arguing about anti-reason is somehow my feeling is more important than the truth. This is what you're basically discussing. And when you think about what was discussed also in the past, the idea of our emotions or belief was more important than truth is not something which is completely new. So I think that what's been happening is that because of the atomizations, people are trying to go into the area that they are more comfortable with as individuals. So they will be into an echo chamber or two groups of people that relate to what they are thinking. But it's more of the atomization of society. So the collectivity has disappeared, and people want to be in places where they feel comfortable. But I don't think it's a question of lack of rational. It's more a question of being comfortable as an individual in a world where people see it as going away and becoming mad. There is no political movement, there is no community, there is no collectivity. This is what used to be part of people's life. So now they're going towards, echo chamber where they can have same ideas and being comfortable with.
I think those echo chambers offer community to people, which is often where the kind of spiraling of that thought process becomes. So whenever you have people, like, for example, I live in a village that is very new age hippie, for example, and they, a lot of people there, they don't believe in modern medicine. They're very anti-establishment, anti-world view. They're very dissociated and disengaged from active politics, from external community, beyond their tiny little bubble. And all of their kind of conspiratorial things they get created in this echo chamber, both online and within their community that they have built. And for them, this is kind of my observation. It's not any based on anything other than my observations, but for the community, that is also what holds it together, is this echo chamber. And I think I've seen that in other places online as well, and I think it's quite difficult to just, for me, the idea that rationale will overcome is quite reductive in a sense, because I feel like it's very absorbing, this idea that this bubble just is your echo chamber, it is your community, it is everything that you want. And the erosion of external community on a more engaged societal level has been kind of shifted to the online echo chamber and small community bubble of, yes, just hearing your same thing. So the rationale, from what I have seen, the rationale does get eroded at that point, and to pull people out of that is quite a challenge.
I mean, I understand it, because I'm also disagree. I mean, I always complain about the echo chamber on social media. That's why I try to go to different places to have a feel of different point of view. Because first of all, for me, I get bored. If I hear the same thing after a while, it's just like, actually, I hate when I agree with people. I just think it doesn't I mean, people know me knows. When I agree, I don't say anything. If I agree, there is nothing to go further. It's when you disagree that there is something interesting, because then you can find out where you disagree, but also why we disagree and who is right. And because I think for me it's important to be able to develop ideas, you have to go towards the disagreement, not the agreement. I mean, agreement is, yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree. Oh, yeah, I agree. And then you end up finishing conversation. So the echo chamber for me is a problem, but I don't think it's a problem because people are getting isolated. But when you think about most people today, they seem to be living in a world where they see each other as the problem. If you look at how COVID is being done, the discussion is about who is responsible for promoting the propagating COVID, and whether or not you should wear a mask or not. And the discussion is always about who is to blame, which individuals are to blame for the others. So there is a sense that somehow we cannot trust each other. And this is an important, so I agree on that level that people are saying that we have to build a trust and we have to believe in ourselves, because this is what is important. And at the moment, this echo chamber is a result. It's like we are an individual. When I look at some of the research on self and identity, it really shows how we saw ourselves more and more, at least in the Western world, more and more as individual. Instead of looking at us as social beings and within society, there's more and more a sense of we are as individuals and the truth comes from us. So it's not, actually, that's the reason also we're saying it's not a new ideas. The idea that the truth comes from our own minds is the old ideas have been developed for quite a long time with the discussion about the self and the discussions about the identity. So if you believe the truth comes from you as an individual and you have people who are being mistrusted, then you will need to go to the area that people are agreeing with you to feel comfortable, because if you feel comfortable, you have people who have the same truth as you, and you feel better. And I see it as connections of different views that put things together in a way in the wrong direction. So how we see each other, how we see humanity, and how we see the world is connected and lead us to things like echo chamber. How we see each other as individuals. The way I understand humanity today is different than other people, and if we want to understand our differences, we have to go in a very basic things. I believe people are rational. Most people think that people are irrational and emotional and cannot make decisions independent from what's everything else happening. So if you have that level of understanding of humanity compared to the rational individual, then your politics will be different. Your attitude will be different.
Does that not rely on the ability for your idea of rational humans? And I do agree with you, but does it not still rely on exposure and education for people rather than being sucked into echo chambers?
I think echo chamber is a problem for critical thinking.
Yeah, but that's what I think a lot of rationale comes from, is the human ability to critically think, because we have been exposed to more things. Our rationale is eroded in an echo chamber because we are not able to get a full picture. I may be wrong.
What I mean by reason is we have reason and we use it. And I think what you meant by that is that we do not use reason anymore in echo chamber. So we haven't lost the reason, we just do not use a rational mind to be able to understand and control the world. That's what you're basically saying, because we see the world in a very restricted way.
Yeah, I think it is hard to be rational whenever you're viewing something that is redacted.
Yes, you could say that, because one way you could say that, because you could say that if I have an ideas and I only see the ideas that I agree with all the time, then I don't think about my ideas anymore. I take it as a fact. Not as a fact, sorry, as I take it as granted, and I don't question myself anymore. So in that sense, yes, you could say that. I suppose you could say that. I mean, for me, echo chamber is a problem. So I agree, for me, it's a problem, but I don't think it means that we don't have reason. It just means that because of the echo chamber, we don't have the possibility of looking at a different alternative viewpoint, because at the end of the day, it's all about the way we see the world is come from us. There is the world, an objective world, and there is a human who interprets that we see today. And then the interpretations of this world, there will be different interpretations. And if we are only involved in one interpretation, we are going to be wrong. So in echo chamber, you will have one interpretation and we follow the interpretation and we never questions the way that we see the world today. And that is, for me, it's not very good for human ability to think and criticize and control and understand. Because understanding is about challenging and understanding and developing new ideas.
Yeah, I think I actually wanted to, so about sort of so I can hear myself back in somebody else's microphone, put me off slightly. But yeah, so the notion of, I wanted to sort of talk about buying elections. So the idea that people aren't rational, or that, oh yeah, and right back to when Max was making the point about how the monopolization of sort of mainstream media, not social media, but like newspapers, old-fashioned stuff, and TV and all that, how that is still really effective in society, and how there's a very strong correlation between the kind of agendas that are put forward in the media and public opinion, also election results and things like that. And I guess that's supported in sort of the correlation between the amount of money that is given to political parties, especially in the USA, and election results. So it seems like there's a very accurate relation between the amount of money that is donated to a particular party and the winner of the US election, to quite a scary extent. So it seems like the more power you have, and obviously the more money you have means the more power, means that you have a much greater influence on what people are actually going to think and how they're going to vote. But there are also counterexamples to that. So the Democratic win in Georgia, which sort of confirmed Biden as the victor. In some ways, I mean, that was a very close election result. That was always going to be really close. But that win, from just reading related articles and literature and stuff, didn't really come from God, because it was Biden and his views. It was the mobilization of various populations that don't usually vote, young people and black people in that state, by grassroots organizations affiliated with the Democratic Party, which is distinct from the liberal center of the Democratic Party. So there is an opportunity for us, for leftists, to influence people to change their political affiliation, or to mobilize people who were previously thought of as apolitical, maybe, or thought of themselves as apolitical, into actually taking a stance on something. And there's also studies that show that there's a really close correlation between economic inequality and the way that people vote and voting patterns. So the way that growth has been captured since the 70s, I think this data relates to the USA, but it carries over in a lot of the Western Hemisphere, is that the top 20% have captured pretty much all the growth in the last 50 years since the end of the Bretton Woods regime, and the bottom 80% haven't really seen a pay rise when you take inflation into account since then either. And you can track people's conservatism and far right views just based on that index. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, and ideologies play a role. But I think what that shows is that if you change those basic material circumstances, you open up a space for people to become more open to left ideas, socialism, etc., or whatever you want to specify. And also, if you are able to communicate that message that there are only these minorities with power, such a great level of influence, you can influence people by that means as well. So all of that is to say that I'm with you, Christine, that I'm not a skeptic with regard to the demos. I think that people, despite their often misguided or reprehensible views related to race or immigration and all these things can be convinced to change their political affiliations, but you just have to take seriously the material conditions which led to them having those right-wing views in the first place.
I agree. For me, there is enough example of how people change their point of view throughout their life, but also through history. I mean, when you look at the women's right, black right, gay and lesbian right, trans, you can see people's positions throughout history has changed. So even within a life, people will change. So yes, you have to find the alternative explanations. So why, I mean, you have to change their material life, but also you have to find the alternative explanations of why they do not have, for example, why is it that at the moment some people are suffering more from COVID than others? Is it because it's just race? I don't think it's so. Is it because of their material conditions? You know, you have to find the alternative explanations. I mean, people are rational, so they have experiences, and we need to be able to explain in one way, why is it that their explanation, a private explanation, is not the right one, but there is a better way of explaining their problems, basically social problems. Today, for example, everything is being discussed psychology. So all the explanation that we have in politics today is related to psychology. So we have to find a way of showing that actually to be able to explain the world, we have to go back to understanding society, not psychology and individual psychology. Because today, individual psychology is the only explanation that people hear today. You know, people are selfish, people are greedy, people are racist, it's all about individual psychology. And that's been an explanation since 20th century. This is not old way of looking at the world. Psychology is new. But today, you can explain everything about people's life through psychology. We have to find an alternative point of view. We cannot ignore what people are facing, but we also have to explain in a different way what they are facing.
Because you keep mentioning your intellectual development, I was just wondering how has your ideas sort of changed over the years?
The last 2 years I've been going to from supporting groups that fighting for liberal ideas and liberal or whatever, I mean not only liberal but concentrating on liberal values, to thinking that we have to go back to more of a lefty thing. Yeah. So it's more that I'm thinking that there is a reason why people disagree with free speech, and it's not because they want people to be banned or whatever. It's because they realize that free speech on its own doesn't mean much when you don't have the opportunity to speak. So how to basically, I'm still changing, but I think I'm becoming. I decided to go back to go back and understanding Marx, understanding the Enlightenment, understanding some of ideas that people have been discussing for centuries. But so the antiquity, try to understand because what was one of the things that was a concern to me in discussion about Brexit in Britain, is that everybody's saying, oh, you know, we need to have democracy, and this is one of the arguments I used to have. You know, yes, we know Brexit, it was a democratic vote, so we have to support Brexit as a democratic vote. Then you're thinking, what do they mean by democracy? I mean, how can somebody who doesn't care about freedom for different sections of society can support the same notion of democracy than I support? So I went through that. I mean, I went through trying to see if there is different meaning of democracy that's been lost, different understanding meaning of freedom has been lost, and this is how I end up being less of a liberal. So the book, you will see I'm still a liberal on that, less of a liberal and more of a kind of going back to a more radical left, understanding what it means to be politics.
When's the book out? Because I'm quite excited to read it.
End of May.
Do you feel like even since the book you've changed your views somewhat? Or?
In some ways, yes. I mean, in the book I still very much on the freedom of speech, but I was trying to, I decided to go back to the basic, because when you listen to American politics on race, and I was surprised because for me, when I follow UK politics or French politics, a lot of people do not support the idea of race as a scientific category. But when you listen to American politics, it is like as if like you have the race is a social construct versus race is a biological understanding. And then I decided in the book to go into understanding where this concept of race originated, because it challenged, when you understand the concept of race and how it developed over the years and by whom, you also challenge quite a few of the anti-racist arguments. So for example, race as being a sin, original sin, or we're all racist. All these arguments, I think, becomes completely wrong when you understand the origin of the concept of race. For me, the concept of race started in the 18th, 19th century, and it became a way of understanding why there is inequality in society that should be free. I mean, should be equal. So I wanted to understand the concept of race, how it developed. And then by understanding the concept of race, I also went into this discussion about national identity, because race today is racial identity and national identity. And I discovered that it was very linked, national identity and race and culture. So I decided to go there, and then this is how I end up being interested in the issue of politics versus identity politics and the issues of freedom. And at the moment, I'm trying to work out in my mind how to cohere, how to understand, basically how to go about linking liberal freedom that people are arguing and the freedom that, for me, I would want to have as, for example, as a Black person. Do I want to go back to the past, or do I want to have a world where it doesn't matter whether you're Black, white, green, pink, or whatever? How do I want to go about doing that? Why is it that we still have these discussions, basically? There's still a lot of things to read and think about.
I think there always is, isn't there? You feel like you get through some, then you end up...
Oh, there is every time I read some books and I think, oh my God, why is it that nobody reads this book? It's just such interesting books. And the discussion about freedom, for example, there was, I think I mentioned that to you, there's two books that for me was quite useful. The book by Philippe Petit, discussing the two different types of freedom, the Republican freedom and liberal freedom. And then you have the new book from, I don't know how to pronounce her name, Annelian de Jean, which is Freedom and Unruly History, where she basically shows how the discussion about freedom today, the meaning of freedom today, is based on the anti-democratic meaning of freedom that was developed after the revolutions. Basically, it's not Enlightenment notion of freedom, but it's an anti-democratic notion of freedom, basically a liberal notion of freedom. You know, it's funny because if you ask for a freedom to be able to govern yourself, it's not possible to do it today. But if you're saying to people, it doesn't matter whether you're exploited, for example, as a worker, but you have the right to free speech, then you can see, for me, I can see very clearly the loss of meaning of an important concept.
Yeah, no, they sounded really fascinating books. I haven't had probably a chance to read them, but when you mentioned them, I did had a look. And I especially found the second one on the unruly history of freedom sounds really fascinating.
And the other author that at the moment studying is Ellen Maxine Wood, who's I think is very good in understanding politics in that sense of capitalism with formal politics world, and a difference between capitalism to the feudal society. In a feudal society, for example, you have economic, social, and political power were quite linked. Capitalism is unique in the differentiation between the social, political, and economic power. That is also really the reason why you cannot directly apply the discussions about democracy from the antiquity to today, because capitalism is unique in that differentiation between political, economic, and social power. In one way, I am very confused, but also very confusing. But for me, I enjoy the developments of and thinking of the ideas. And I think that at the moment, this is one of the things that people don't do anymore. They're looking for certainty. And if you are confused and confusing about your ideas, you do not have certainties. But at the same time, it allows you to have an open mind about other ideas. This is how I see it.
There's a thing that I quite like to do is to make sure you sort of challenge yourself. In some sense, your enemies can be a useful ally in a certain sense that they help you make your thought even better.
I mean, when somebody's telling you something and then you think, oh my God, I've never thought about that. And then you say, oh God, am I wrong? Have I been wrong? I mean, for me, I spend my time questioning myself all the time. Mm-hmm. And I know that maybe in years' time, my ideas might be different. But I don't mind, because I just think that it's, I'm not saying it as an intellectual journey also, because I'm a political person, so I do have an aim. I just think that this need for people to have a certainty is what, people want to be certain about something, and they want to keep their certainty. And I think this is one of the problems of today, because everything's changing all the time. The world is moving, no more than before. Just think about it. If you lived in American Revolution, time of the American Revolution, or the French Revolution, the world wasn't very certain, yes? I mean, there was more upheaval in 19th century, in 18th century, and we're still here today thinking that our world is just changing. People are looking at it as if it was like the big change, and we are not living in a world changing faster than other worlds. But at the same time, there is this need today, because we are very much individual, at least in the West, this need that we have to have point of view that are very certain, that stays there, that we have to be certain about the world and about our own ideas. And I think this is wrong. to question yourself all the time is difficult, but I think it's the only way to develop, to develop yourself, to be uncertain and carry on. And
there's days where I don't feel like I want a big debate. And there's some days where I feel like I'm completely up for it. So I'm not always wanting to be challenged, I guess. But I think it's also...
That's normal.
Yeah. Everyone's slowly disappearing.
Well, it's late. And it's nearly midnight for me. I'm in Germany.
Oh, thank you so much for doing this.
No, but thank you for inviting me.
Yeah,
I enjoy. Actually, I enjoy because it's. I'm thinking, oh my God, Christine, you haven't thought about so many ideas. You need to go back to reading and thinking. You think people always say when you write, you develop your ideas. But when you talk also, when you try to explain to somebody, you develop it. I was thinking, I know what I think. This is my point of view. And then I come to this meeting and I'm, how can I explain it? How can I view? I mean, I explain to my husband, but my husband knows me. So he's like, yeah, Christine. How can I explain it to other people? How can I try to give the sense of where I'm going? And even if I'm uncertain of where I'm going, I still have a direction that I want to go. This is difficult, huh? It's
always hard, I think, to sometimes just put things into words, isn't it? You kind of know, but it's getting the right words to articulate.
Exactly. So I really enjoyed the conversation.
It's been a great conversation.
It's embarrassing. I'm not going to listen to myself again. I'm sorry to say. Just the thought of hearing my voice. Oh.
Do you hear your own voice coming through the headphones?
Yes, this is the problem also. But if I don't have that, I don't hear very well. So it's weird to talk through that because it's weird. If you have these things, it's weird, yeah? Yeah. So I really enjoy, actually. I think it's very nice to do that.
Oh, what, just chatting and discussing?
Yeah, don't you think? I mean...
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's why we do this regularly.
Yeah, there is always this, you go to some meetings and it's like, you don't know, and you have the expert, and then you have this, everybody's trying to see if the expert is right or wrong. This is kind of nice for some things, but I also like the journey of different people trying to go through different ideas. This idea that different people from different backgrounds trying to see if they're going in the same directions or not,
Yeah, I think some of my favourite sessions have really been when everyone's just completely coming from, have such different backgrounds, and suddenly they're talking and they're sharing ideas with each other, and you can see they're actually thinking things that they possibly haven't thought before because they're such different people, or they have different backgrounds, really. So I think those are the ones that excite me the most.
Thank you for inviting me.
Really... thank you for doing that. I was really pleased that we could do a session on this, actually. It was really fascinating. And yeah, just feels like a topic that was just worth covering, actually.
I think it's a big topic. I think we cannot...
No, it's fascinating, really interesting stuff, really cool perspectives. I tend to be a bit timid in these types of situations. So just as a person who has essentially just lurked, it was incredibly enjoyable, really invigorating sort of stuff to think about. Really cool. Okay. Thank you for hanging with.
Yeah. And, thank you so much, Christine. You at the uni tomorrow, or you?
No. I kind of gave my thesis, but I would like to, like I said, I'm a developing thing, so I would like to carry on. The thesis is different than the book because I changed. I would like to carry on, especially on identity politics. I would like to discussion about liberatory politics. So the left-wing identity politics. In a sense, you could say it's good, but I want to see why is it that we have. Is it really good today? I mean, is it still useful? So.
Yeah. I look forward to seeing stuff if you when you get stuff up. I suppose your book's coming out. I'll look up.
I mean, I should be supporting my book. Yeah, I might read my book. I'm not. I don't sell. It's not. I'm not very good in selling myself. This is my problem. But because I also think that there is so many other books that are useful. I mean, I think this is the problem also. It's like I said to people, you have to, there is so many things to read. Yeah, you have Google, and you're thinking, Google is for information. There is a difference between information and knowledge. I don't have memory for details. So in 1974, they did that because I don't have this memory of details anymore for some reason. For me, you can have Googles for that. If you want to have a specific date, you can have Google. But to be able to understand people's ideas and to be able to argue and to be able to, it's important to understand it, but also to argue and then to go further. I think this is what we need to read more than just Google. Also in journal articles, newspaper articles are just short, and very often those people repeat the same things as they read in other newspapers. So it's not enough. I'm a book advertiser. Read books. But you have also other books that are less known. but people say it's about developing an ideas. And in those books, because they develop ideas, you can also agree with them on different levels. So
especially because the length you have to, in order to put something online, it's harder.
yeah, but look at the media. And when I started to do identity politics, all the articles were the same thing. Identity politics was developed in 1960s. It's the same thing again and again and again. It's like one person reads something, and then the others just follow the same things. They repeat the same thing. Identity politics started in the 60s, postmodernism and Marcuse. So in the beginning, when I was reading, it's like all Marcuse and Frankfurt School and 1960s. And then I went to a bit further than just media, and then realized that there is other point of view about identity politics that started in 18th, 19th century, or nothing to do with or at least not only Frankfurt School. So, you go further than just. So, I'm sorry to say. Bye-bye. Nice.
Bye, Christine. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you for listening. This has been the Exploding Appendix podcast. If you like this podcast and would like to hear more, please visit our website at www.explodingappendix.com. Exploding Appendix, ideas and culture with guts. Hold on to me. Don't let me go. Who cares what they see? Who cares what they know? Your first name is free. Last name is Dom. We choose to believe in where we are from. Man's red flower. It's in every living thing. Mind, use your power. Spirit, use your wings. Freedom. 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 Hold on to me.